So the first session, how can European Buddhism embrace modern worldviews? So we are going to speak about what we can call modern Buddhism and maybe the process of cultural adaptation which is going on, and what happened when Buddhism takes root in a society characterized by traits such as secularism, liberalism, scientific thinking, and technology. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the European Buddhist Union and the other bodies involved for having invited me to this event. And it's a great pleasure to meet both old friends and new faces, and to be present within what I think is one of the great strengths of Buddhism in Europe, and that is its diversity. In other words, if we go to a particular country in Asia, most Buddhists of that country will belong to a particular tradition and school or schools. What's happening in modernity and in the West in general, or one might, I think now say globally, is that Buddhists are getting to meet each other. And in Europe, we have the situation where in pretty much any major European city today, within a few minutes or more, you can find yourself in a Theravada vihara, in a Tibetan Buddhist center, in a zendo, in a meeting of the Soka Gakkai, in any number of different Buddhist communities that have sprung up. And historically, this is very unusual. It's a feature of modernity that people are able to travel and to move around so easily. But the consequence of it is that Buddhists no longer find themselves just within the frame of their own traditions, and that they are inevitably going to encounter forms of Buddhist thought and practice that they may not really have come across before. There's always the temptation to withdraw into the protective shell of your own school. And I think there are times in one's training when that's a good thing, to be honest. But at the same time, as one's practice matures, you are confronted with the fact that not all Buddhists think the same. The other element, I think, that strikes me as particularly important here is the very fact of historical consciousness itself. The fact that the very way this conference has been framed as Buddhism 2075 implies very much a way of thinking. We look back in 50 years to 1975, we look forward ahead, and we see our lives very much as embedded in conditions of the past that have given rise to the situations we find ourselves now, and a situation now that through our thoughts and our words and our deeds will create a future that will appear in 2075. Buddhist traditions have not generally been particularly influenced by historical consciousness. I think it is a feature of Western rationality, probably starting really with the European Enlightenment, but it has framed our minds in such a way that, in my understanding, we can come to engage with one of the most central doctrines in Buddhism, that of dependent origination, conditionality, paticca samuppada, however you translate that, which is basically a wonderful frame in which to understand history. So as an historically informed society, we find a point of meeting between traditional Buddhist values and ideas, impermanence and change. Things are always moving. There's always opportunities to create something that's less toxic, causes less suffering, brings greater well-being and community. And this is all happening very much within the framework of an historical understanding. One final point I'll rest on, and that is for Buddhism, perhaps at this juncture in its history, to reflect upon how Buddhism or the Dharma itself is also subject to what Buddhists call the three marks of being. Buddhism is impermanent. Buddhism is at some level imperfect, unsatisfactory, and Buddhism is a non-essentialist tradition. There is no essential Buddhism, some core nugget of what it really is, which reflects very much the idea of there being no concrete or reified self, no self-existent essence of the religion, but points to how the Dharma is something that is constantly in the process of self-reflection, self-transformation, and I feel very much has a capacity to envision a future that is not just about a repetition of the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think in a way, I mean, I've been also reflecting on this, the theme of this conference or this gathering, and this provocative, statements like, how should we envision Buddhism? So somehow it seems to me that really, I mean, typically Buddhism doesn't come from a normative stance, but it's more of a responsive project to whatever is arising. So somehow I think it's basically like provocative, this idea of how should we envision things, or it's really like recognizing the way things have changed so far and the way things are still changing. And can you hear me? Okay, maybe I should go a little closer. Yeah, so I think one of the assets that probably we have vis-a-vis the earlier historical condition in Europe or in so-called Western Buddhism is that actually we can come to a more meaningful self-reflection and understanding of our own Buddhist identity and identities as constructed identities. So maybe emerging from this Buddhist modernist paradigm into this and fully acknowledging this, the impact of postmodernist ideologies on the shaping of our own identities, and somehow really understanding that we are conditioned in the way we self-reflect on ourselves as Buddhist practitioners or agents. So I think this sense of non-identification with one's own inheritance, be it traditional or modernist or postmodernist or whatever that is an asset that we can have. And probably one of the newest tools available is this committed and meaningful dialogue with the academic study of Buddhism. Of course, here I'm blowing my own trumpet a bit, coming from an academic perspective, but I think that somehow contemporary Buddhist traditions in non-traditional societies do lack this serious engagement with academic self-reflection and text historically informed, religio-historically informed perspective on the historical formation of identities. So there has been, typically like either celebration of subjectivities, so anti-scholastic agendas on the one hand, or on the other hand, dogmatic, traditionalist, scholastic, typically scholastic. By scholastic, I really mean the equivalent or the counterpart to medieval scholasticism as a kind of an overall exegetical project. So I think it's really striking this midway between this blind emphasis on subjectivity as if inherently authoritative or authoritative. My English is all over the place. I've been traveling too much. Anyway, whatever the accent goes. So anyway, and on the other hand, this dogmatic assertion of our beliefs or what we have inherited from our own Buddhist backgrounds, I think is quite new in a way, and I sincerely think that we cannot avoid displacement of the Buddhist traditions in their own historical context, and also looking at how change has already happened throughout Buddhist history, and really, I really think it's time to maybe come out of this more infantile relationship we've all had with this wonderful heartfelt encounter with the Dharma, but really, I mean, like as contemporary agents in history, there is more to that than just receiving it, being on the receiving end, and really assessing the conditionality of the way we've also been building our Buddhist identities. And I think this is inherently non-essentialist in a way and inherently non-dogmatic, because if I understand that my own understanding of the practice and the doctrinal framework is conditioned and shaped by my own conditionings, then I can no longer so dogmatically assert that this is the one or right way or best way and all of that. So yeah, I do think that somehow this giving more space to self-reflection and including the social construction of identities, not just the individual sort of psychologized sense of selfhood, which is also what so-called Western Buddhism has been mostly about. It's quite important. I mean, in the traditional Buddhist analysis of identities, we come to consciousness as that which I am. So the I am which embraces experience. So this I am doesn't really exclude social dimensions or political dimensions. So it's really already inherent and embedded in the Buddhist teachings that our being aware or conscious beings in the world does involve all these different dimensions. So somehow we might need to reintegrate something which is already part of that and has been cut off by this intimate sort of approach to the teachings or this sort of individualistic capitalist and now post-capitalist attitude to the teachings as if they were about this personal project of self-development and as if we could isolate ourselves from the wider context. Yeah, maybe this is what I had to say. And maybe in the name of non-proliferation, I will cut it short.
Would it be okay if I stand and walk a little bit? I'm the outlier here. I'm not a European. So invited from Hawaii and flying in 18 or 20 hours, it's better if I stand and talk rather than sitting down, since I might nod off. But it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to have been invited. And thanks to all the organizers. And it's really wonderful to see a gathering like this of a couple of hundred people who are here to speculate about the future of Buddhism. Kind of taking the guiding question from Francesco and asking questions, is there such a thing as European Buddhism? And I think that the answer to that is there should be, but maybe not yet. And I mean, Buddhism has no self-nature. This is something that Stephen sort of pointed out and that Damodana also sort of referred to. There's a without self nature to Buddhism itself. Conventionally speaking, though, there's lots of forms of Buddhism. And everywhere that Buddhism has spread over time, over the last 2,600 years, Buddhism has adapted to the local conditions. And Buddhism has become as varied in its forms and its expressions of the Dharma as these traditions are in terms of their landscapes that they're in and the cuisines of the people who practice in these traditions. So I think Buddhism has continually changed over 2,600 years, and there's no reason why it would stop doing that. So we would expect at some point that there would be a European or an American Buddhism. And the fact is that the Buddha himself said to his disciples when they're going out and spreading the Dharma, don't get hung up on my words. Express my meaning. Use the local vernacular. Use the local languages. When Buddhism was spreading in India like today, India has, I think, 320 officially recognized languages. And India back then was the same. People have different languages from town to town, village to village. So you adapt that. And you come up with new ways of expressing things, new analogies, new metaphors to use. So I think there will become a European Buddhism, a South African Buddhism, a American Buddhism, a Latin American Buddhism. Absolutely there will be. But I think we want to step back and wonder, what will that look like? And I don't think that looking back at the past does us much good with that. That if we look back at Buddhism spreading across Asia, everywhere that Buddhism went, at some point, it became the state religion. It became the religion of the governing elite. And I don't see that happening in Europe. I don't see that happening in the United States. But what I think we can anticipate is that every time Buddhism has moved, it's generated both practices for the popular people, everyday people. that gives everyday people the rituals and the day-to-day practices that enable them to engage their world, their life circumstances, their relationships in ways that are wiser and more compassionate, and to develop over their lifetimes in doing that. And Buddhism can offer that to people today. But it will also have to speak to elites, and to convince elites, whether in government, whether in science, whether in industry and in business, education, to be able to take Buddhist principles and to be able to find ways of applying those in the contemporary context that makes sense. And so I think that that's our agenda for the next 50 years to 2075, is figuring out what does that mean. And there's going to be tensions. So for people who come from a Western society, we've grown up in a world in which you're taught from a small child up to be an individual, to have your own beliefs and values, to act on your own cognizance. This is not typically Asian. So I have a mixed family of Asian wife, and we call them in Hawaii a hapasan, half-half. And there's lots of tensions raising a child like that, where the mom, in my case, expects that child to be very Confucian in his attitude toward his parents. And he's growing up in a society where he's being encouraged, think for yourself. Don't take what your parents say and do what your parents tell you to do and follow their rituals. There's tensions involved in that. But I think tensions are good. If you take an analogy to playing guitar, I play a little guitar, and if your strings don't have good tension, then the body of the guitar can't sing. You have to get the tensions of the strings right. So I think part of what we're trying to do is to find ways of getting the tensions between a kind of a Western liberal understanding of personhood and society and government, and trying to get the tension with that right, with Buddhist emphasis on acting wisely, compassionately, looking at the Brahma Vihara and thinking these are modes of relational perfection we ought to all be engaged in, but how do we do that in this contemporary context? There are real tensions there. The one that I would single out, because it was sort of referenced by Francesco, is the tensions with science and technology. You know, science and technology, interesting. They're all about causality, right? Finding out how to explain how everything happens. This is the causal project. The modern Western scientific project is figuring out what are the immutable laws of nature, such that if you know the initial conditions of something, you can predict everything that will happen after that. That's the holy grail of Western science. Find those immutable laws, and from any initial conditions, you can discover what will happen next. Well, guess what? That's not a very Buddhist way of understanding causality, because there's this tension with the idea that if you had such a world, if we lived in such a world, and as the interlocutors of the Buddha were saying in his lifetime, hey, you talk about karma, the Buddha, you talk about karma, you talk about an infinite past, an infinitely deep past, a cosmos without a beginning. That means that we've had an infinite amount of time to make bad karma. If we've had an infinite amount of time to make bad karma, then there's no way to work your way through all that infinite amount of bad karma. Therefore, enlightenment is possible in your terms. And the Buddha's response was, you misunderstand karma entirely. The whole point about karma is that it is not a deterministic system about the world. It's a non-deterministic emergent order. We have a role to play in that. Our karma is a function of our values, our intentions, and the way in which we enact those values and intentions. It's not a fixed deterministic moralistic system. We're in a participatory cosmos. We can change the nature of the cosmos. We can realize Buddha realms. In this world realm, we can realize Buddha realms. That is our agenda. And so taking science and its project of causal determinism and trying to find those immutable laws of nature, that's in tension with Buddhism. So there's a very famous philosopher, Daniel Dennett, who, with this reductionist, physicalist way of understanding the world, says that the cosmos that we find ourselves in is one in which, it's too good. I was going to try to imagine myself quoting it, but I better read them directly because it's really great. Daniel Dennett, an impersonal, unreflective, robotic, mindless little scrap of molecular machinery is the ultimate basis of all the agency and hence meaning and hence consciousness in the universe. Now, Buddhists are not about blind belief in anything. So you can't really, I don't think, have Buddhist heresy because there's not that kind of doctrine. But if anything comes close to Buddhist heresy, that statement is Buddhist heresy. Why? Because it says you have no agency. Free will is an illusion. Changing your karma, Forget it. You cannot. It's just a mindless, unreflective, robotic, molecular machinery that's playing out over time. And that's it. Get used to it. And Dennett's not alone in this. There are many, many people in the scientific world that feel the same way. So one of the things that I think is incumbent upon us as Buddhists in the 21st century is to go to scientists and say, your views are limited. Where we stand with respect to science today is like where the Buddha stood with respect to karma in his day. In his day, karma was the theory of the universe in the Vedic traditions where there's a moral law, a cosmic moral law, according which every action will have a specific reaction, a specific just moral desert will come to you, a deterministic system. And the Buddha said, you're close. You're 100% right, but 50% of the time. Because there's another part of the time when you can change your values and intentions and change your karma. It's not a fixed result. And this idea that you don't argue by refutation, but rather by relegation, is something that Japanese philosopher Tom Kasulis kind of coined this idea. Argument by refutation, that's what we're used to. You're wrong, and I'm right. This gets us nowhere in the world today. Argument by relegation says, you know what, you are right, Francesco. 100% of the time, your views about lucid dreaming are right. But only 90% of the time. There's 10% when it just doesn't work. So I think in much the same way that scientists have realized that Newtonian physics works perfectly well at a certain range of phenomenon. 70% of all the things that we observe in the universe, you can explain with Newtonian physics. But then there's another 20% that you need relativity physics, and for which you need quantum physics. And I think Buddhism says, Western science, you're really good. 90% of what's going on in the observed universe, you can handle. Perfect, 100% right, 90% of the time. But what Buddhism offers is a reflection on that 10%. Because what science today tells us is what the observed universe is doing and gives no account whatsoever for the observing universe. If you took away the observing universe, that is consciousness, mentality, free will, you take that out of the equation, what is left of the cosmos? Nothing. Without that observation, we could reflect and say, oh yeah, you take consciousness out of the picture and you're still going to have the stars and the galaxies and all the rest, but on what basis could you make that claim? Without consciousness, there's no such thing as stars or galaxies or space or time or any of the rest of that. And so I think what Buddhists are in a position of doing is going to scientists and say, let us help you do science better. And there's lots of opportunity for that because scientists themselves are realizing the limitations of physicalist reductionism. What they don't have, however, is a capacity for looking at the issues and saying, it's not just figuring out how matter operates. They're really good about that. But they have no reflection whatsoever about what matters. Explaining matter is one thing, but digging into deeply what matters as we construct our realities and our worlds, as we formulate the values and the intentions and enact those values and intentions in ways that realize the environments that we live in socially and politically and economically, this is something that we are responsible for. We need to be responsive to these conditions, but act with full responsibility. And one of the things we'll talk about maybe later in the day is the stuff about technology. But for my concern, what physicalist reductionism does is it tells us consciousness doesn't matter. You have no free will ultimately. And therefore, no matter what's happening with the manipulation of consciousness through, say, mass media or through artificial intelligence, it doesn't really matter. I think it matters hugely. And that one of the things that we Buddhists can do as we move forward over the next 50 years, some of us won't be there for all those 50, is to really deeply reflect on how do we together develop shared understandings of what matters most for humanity as we move forward to realizing the kinds of worlds that live up to the best of what we can possibly be as Buddhists and as human beings. Thanks.
I would like to offer a term, an interpretation basically of a term. a double interpretation of a term. And the term is interdependence, but the double interpretation would be circulation and constraints. And I would like to offer these two terms as not only interpretations of interdependence, but as possibly a way forward for Buddhism. The question was asked, what type of future we envision, in order to be able to tell what type of Buddhism we should develop in the coming decades. So I hope, and that's just a hope, and we may not get there, that the future in 50 years' time will be more interdependent than it is now. Of course, the reality is interdependent, but we don't function like that. If that's true, then I would like to give an interpretation of these two terms, circulation and constraints, in the context of Buddhism, the following way. These two terms come from Francisco Varela's work, who was one of the co-founders of Mind and Life Institute and Mind and Life Europe, together with the Dalai Lama. And he initiated, together with His Holiness, the dialogue between science, Buddhism, social sciences, humanities, and philosophy, for one particular reason. He understood that the mystery of life, that very mystery, what life is, basically what consciousness is, what mind is, cannot be answered from one particular perspective. It cannot be answered. It can only be approached through multiple gateways. So the mystery is at the center, and we try to get there through multiple gateways. One gateway, of course, living in the modern Western context, is science. We have heard about the limitations of science. I don't want to go there. I can just only repeat that. Another gateway to that mystery is philosophy, humanities, basically all our larger questions. And the third one, arts included. And the third one is the contemplative tradition, contemplative practice, Buddhism included. But not only Buddhism, other contemplative practices and traditions as well. If that's true, that there are multiple gateways, how do they relate to each other? They relate to each other through circulation and constraints. Circulation meaning that one of these dimensions comes up with an idea and then shares this idea with the other domains. And the other domains come and reflect on that sharing, reflect on that proposal, and take a look at it from their own perspective. And then the various ideas, the various findings, the various discoveries are circulated among these very dimensions. So science is not the only truth in that sense. For him as a scientist, for Francisco Varela as a scientist, that was clear. But that means that the contemplative traditions are only gateways themselves. And there are other approaches, other gateways too, to the mystery. And that's what constraint means. Mutual constraints, basically, means that these dimensions are mutually constraining each other. None of them can take full dominance over the other domains. And that's what dialogue means. Dialogue is a word that we use too often, and we don't really mean it. That's why I try to replace this word with circulation and constraints, because these two words give us the essence of dialogue, that we circulate ideas and that we know from the very beginning that whatever ideas we have, those ideas are constrained by other perspectives, by other views, by other intersubjective or subjective experiences. The second example I would like to give for this circulation and constraints vision is whether Buddhism is modern or not, or should be modern or not, or should be modernized or not, or how it should be modernized. Actually, Buddhism has been modernized already. So that's not a question. Buddhism has become a modern Buddhism, at least for around 100 years. The question is whether Buddhist modernism or modern Buddhism is on the way to something new again. What is coming after the current status of Buddhism? There are historians of Buddhism studying this phenomena, identifying various dimensions of Buddhism, like pre-modern or pre-global, Jorn Berup from University of Aarhus defined that. Then modern Buddhism, global Buddhism, local Buddhism, meaning that Buddhism becomes local in various contexts. We heard about that today already, some examples like local churches. Even in the local context, we can have different local entities present. And then the question is, what is post-global? Because he has already raised this question whether Buddhism can and would change in the coming years and decades to become something new again in the Western context, in the European context, in this very context that we live in, actually. And because of the European, because of the Western influence. And there are debates which try to make Buddhism either a traditional version or a modern version or a progressive version. And these debates create tension, even within Buddhist circles. I'm a traditionalist, I'm a modernist, I'm a progressive Buddhist. Which Buddhism is the right one? And there I would suggest the same methodology of circulation and constraints, that none of them are right alone. No, none of them are the only reality of Buddhism alone. We would somehow need to find a way of combining and taking the best of these approaches into a new form of Buddhism. What is coming next? And here I would say again, maybe a circulation would help, or a mutual constraints idea would help. And when I was thinking about it, I came up with a term, and then I found that this term exists already, luckily. And this term is transmodernism. It was created in 1989 already by a Spanish philosopher, a lady, Rosa Maria Rodriguez Magda. And she used this term to bring the best of modernity and postmodernity together and transcend them by creating a new way of thinking. And I would propose that this new way of thinking would be addressed in the context of Buddhism as well. And what is transmodernity in that sense? What is transmodernism in that sense? It includes circulation and constraints as a principle, basically dialogue as a principle. It accepts multiple identities, although we know as Buddhists that they don't exist, but still they are conventional realities and temporary, let's say, approximations to the meaning of life and to who we are. So they exist in a way, although we know that they are not the final truths. And then two important, very important aspects are included in this view, surpassing modernity and surpassing postmodernity. One is spirituality, the spiritual perspective of reality, that there must that a non-reductionist, non-materialistic view on experience is needed, and this is expressed by more and more people, luckily. And the last one, I mean, there are many more, of course, but the last important one, most important one, is the ecological perspective, ecological awareness, that we are interdependent, not only between us as human beings, between societies, but also between human life and natural life, or life as such on this planet.
When we talk about European Buddhism, I think we don't talk about a new process. I think we are witnessing a familiar process that Buddhism has done in the past, which is establishing a spiritual tradition within a new cultural landscape. And we've seen this taking place in China, in Tibet, in Japan. So wherever Buddhism traveled, it engaged with the local philosophies, with the local religions, with ways of life and ways of being, and it has evolved and blended and flourished into something new. And I think in Europe it's the same, but here there is more complexity that is brought to the table because of the things that are already here, as you mentioned, secularism, liberal democracy, science, technology. And all of these things already influence the way we engage in social and spiritual life. So you asked the question, should Buddhism take on a modern worldview, or embrace modern worldview? And I would like to offer the perspective that this is inevitable when we talk about European Buddhism, that it we have a modernized version of it anyways. So I would like to ask the question, what it is that we have to protect in this process and what we want to keep. And I study anthropology, and in anthropology we learn that religion is not a set of beliefs. It is a system of rituals, it is stories, it is practices that helps people find their place in the world and navigate through crises like death and sickness. And religion gives meaning, and it creates continuity, it reconnects, and it helps us see ourselves weaved into, like an individual weaved into something bigger. And Buddhism does this incredibly well, not despite the metaphorical foundations that it has. That in your question you asked, should we get rid of those metaphysical concepts? And I think that the concepts of karma and rebirth and samsara, they are not outdated leftovers from a pre-science world. I think it is exactly what has survived throughout cultures and time and space, and they are as valid today as they are 2,500 years ago. And to come back to what Mr. Bachelor said, it's maybe something we need to protect, that it still exists in 2075. I don't know, maybe just an idea. I think there is a bit of a trap that we might fall into, that we think that we need to make Buddhism digestible in a way for modern young minds. I consider myself a Theravada Buddhist, so I really like the ancient ways. But especially young people, I think they can be trusted to understand and make use of these complex metaphysical concepts. And I think especially young people, we are constantly bombarded with, esoteric practices, or at least parts of it, with like pop psychology and new age ideas through social media mainly. And these snippets of spiritual practice, they don't really offer tools for inner transformation. They don't really offer a deep path. So if we are not careful, I think we run the risk that Buddhism becomes limited to something like just a mindfulness exercise or some self-help practice. So yeah, in one way, young people are bombarded with this very superficial way of practicing spirituality. And on the other way, like you said, we are facing a time of deep uncertainty, climate anxiety, economic instability, and maybe the biggest of all for young people is loneliness and breakdown of community and belonging. So this again is, I think, where Buddhism can catch those people facing these fears, because it offers a practice without punishment. And with the Buddhist youth, we do visit monks and nuns, and we have monks and nuns visiting us. And we do like to challenge them, and we always ask questions like, what do you think about homosexuality? What do you think about what's the other big one? Homosexuality. I can't think of another example, but there are more examples. But anyways, certain topics like these, the answers are always very diplomatic, but not really answering them. So they always find a way around it. And I think there we can witness a little bit the outdated social norms and preserved like social values, maybe from 2,500 years ago. So there I do see a place for modernization. And yes, this is a place where we can evolve. But I would also like to remind us that Buddhism, when in its birthing hour, it was already a revolutionary way of practicing spirituality, because the Buddha included women in the monastic order. He rejected the caste system. He rejected ritual animal sacrifices. And like it has been said before, there is this notion of don't follow blindly and don't believe blindly, but really test and test through direct experience. And this is, in our opinion, a very modern idea. And this is exactly where Buddhism aligns with this need for science, or the scientific spirit that we have in Europe. And this is by far the most quoted thing that I hear in my Buddhist youth group, that's this affinity towards the fact that we don't have to believe anything and we don't have to believe what our parents told us to believe in, but we can really test it every day and every time we sit down. So, to conclude, I think we need to make sure that by modernizing Buddhism, it doesn't become hollow in any way, and that we are not afraid to make modern minds a little bit uncomfortable. And also, you know, wherever materialism is challenged, it hurts a little bit in Europe. So yes, I think especially young people will benefit from something that is not a trend and not just a technique, but really a living tradition. And it meets them where they are. And who knows, to respond to what you said before, who knows, if we continue a good collaboration between older generations and the young people, and we empower them to become Buddhists and to call themselves Buddhists, maybe one day we will have a head of states in Europe or in America who is Buddhist. So who knows? Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all. I'm moved by Iona, by your last question. I'm Gunnar Keitu from Norway, the Buddhist Federation there. And you say whenever materialism is challenged, it will hurt a bit. And I think that's a significant challenge. And I'd like to hear how you think our long tradition can help people in the modern world meet the pain of cutting back on our distractions, our papancha, and also all the sensory and digital stimulation of today. Thank you.
I don't think we can. I don't think we can target that goal. I don't think that can be an objective. I don't think we can go out as Buddhists and say, okay, now I'm going to teach the non-Buddhists how to be less attached. But what we can do is we can spread the Dharma and we can invite people to take refuge. And I think this, what you described, is a natural side process, or it's a natural consequence. What is it? Yes, side product, exactly. Collateral damage that happens anyways when we start walking the path. So this is why I encourage young people to come and practice and see for themselves. And I witness it, that it happens automatically then.
I agree very much with what you said. And I'd also like to pick up on what Gabor was talking of, Francisco Varela's centrality of mystery. And for me, I have no interest in social media or any of these things, but I'm also very old. But I think the key to it for me would lie in the fact is introducing not necessarily young people, but people in general, to become more fascinated and struck by the mystery of their own lives, to experience themselves more and more as questions rather than a set of more or less coherent facts that we summarize ourselves as. And certainly my own experience as a young person, I got into Buddhism when I was 19, was that it introduced me into something that was basically much more interesting than what nowadays might be called social media or other kinds of distractions. Because our education in the West does not actually give us those tools. And I remember when I was at school, I was always rather perplexed by the fact that we talked about history, geography, maths, English, and all this stuff, but we never actually addressed the question of what we were feeling, what was actually going on in our own body-mind process. And yet we knew, each of us, that that was the thing that mattered most to us, was this inner experience that nobody, it was a total taboo, an omerta, even to raise those kinds of questions. And I think the Dharma, and meditation particularly, allows us an opening into becoming fascinated, in a sense, awestruck by the fact of being here at all, rather than not being, to put it in rather abstract philosophical terms.
Yeah, very much along the same lines as Johanna. I don't think it's a matter of saying this should be or should not be done. And as a matter of fact, attentional patterns are changing and the way one engages is changing. So I somehow I think it's more of a question of how to embody a more wholesome or healthy relationship with changing media. So, it's like not about preaching, you should do it like this or like that. But somehow, if as a practitioner, I do make use of these tools in some way or the other, in a way which is in line with my goals and is based on integrity, I think that can be like an embodied, more attractive way, just to show how I am with these things. And maybe, if you embody like less restlessness, less kind of attention, kind of disruption or less unhappiness as a result of this kind of superficial engagement, maybe that's appealing in itself and it's kind of soothing. So it could be like an entry point. So I think it's also very much about relationships and embodying, in yourself like a healthy way of being with these tools. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, materialism can be looked at in two ways. One is the more philosophical materialism as a kind of a scientific theory of bias. And the other one's the consumerist materialism. And I think with respect to the second, and maybe which is where the question was coming from, I think it's really important for young people today to pick up on this idea from Varela and so on about embodied presence. And I'll just reflect back. I took a year off from university to pay off loans of my college education. And I had a job at a department store as a laborer, stock clerk. And I rode a bike to this place. It was about a 2-mile, 3-mile bike ride every morning, every afternoon. And it was the first time as a 19-year-old that I had really paid attention to trees and birds. And they're changing stuff every day. So I did this every day for 6 months, and different trees had different birds in them. I started to realize, this tree has these birds, and this tree has these birds, and their songs are different. And that embodied presence immersed me in a world that I'd been passing through for decades, 2 decades, a 19-year-old, but had never really noticed. And so I think that there is something to recommend to young people with respect to social media. There's a lot out there about how social media use affects, especially young people with issues of depression, anxiety, etc. We know that. But to help them to get out of it, I think one thing is a media fast. This is, I would say, maybe related when we talk more about science and tech, we can discuss whether this is enough to address the societal problems. But at least for individuals, going on a media fast is like fasting in other terms. Every religious tradition has traditions of fasting, and there's good reason for that. Because when you interrupt that normal take of energy from the outside world, you're starving those systems within ourselves. Whether you think of them in terms of some scar or what have you, fasting does a number on our samskara, these habits of perception, of embodied presence, of cognition and thought. A media fast does the same type of thing. And it can be very, very effective in re-immersing ourselves in a world of sensory experience where you're just invited, pay real attention. Basic things like taste the food you're eating. Really taste it rather than just wolfing it down while you're watching a video. So I think that there's interesting ways of doing that kind of from the personal side. But I think with young people especially, there's an opportunity to start reframing the media. So there's in the United States this project called Project Liberty, which is all about remaking the internet and trying to find ways of having social media that are built around the kinds of principles that human beings know that they need for their own personal flourishing, that are not being determined by consumers, corporate interests, or by geopolitical interests with state influence on media and how that goes. Actually taking back control of the media and saying, we can develop social media platforms that are interoperable, that allow us to engage one another, to move our data, own our data, keep our data, so that other corporations are not making use of it simply to get us in that feedback loop of more consumption. So I think that's the more political end of it, and that's a very viable possibility, especially for young people who know the tech better than us 70-year-olds do.
Just very briefly, at the college in Budapest, we have a course on Buddhist economics. and we have a lot of young students there. So what we do in one of the classes is that we list all our needs. They list all their needs. I have this need, that need, that need, and we have thousands of needs or hundreds of needs, and we write them on the flip chart. And then I ask them, what do you think is necessary? What do you think is essential for you? And what do you think is superficial or not even needed, or you think that it comes from society or comes from peers or comes from someone else? And we are surprised collectively how many of our needs are basically superficial and how few are very essential and what those needs are. And that's very enlightening. And then we come to the understanding that even in the Pali Canon, there was a differentiation between the basic needs, chanda, and the so-called consumerist needs, the trishna, the craving. And then they understood what craving is and what our essential needs are. This is just a little very concrete, very practical practice we do.
Thank you so much for the really rich discussion. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So my question is, it's not so much an intellectual question, but more one out of a sense of concern and curiosity. So I feel like with, say, the 50th anniversary, that's, a reasonable amount of time to kind of establish Dharma in Europe, I would say. So let's say the Dharma has recently come to the West. There have been movements in engaged Buddhism, but I feel like the world is still very troubled. And I would have hoped that perhaps there would be some more tangible effect at a larger scale by now. So I guess I would ask, what do you think the tangible impact that the Dharma coming to the West has had already at like a more macro scale, and what might be missing to make the world less of a troubled place?
Maybe not a lot of practical impact, but what I see is that students studying Buddhism, whether that's in a community or in a more formal setting, in a college or a Buddhist studies program here or there in the West, they gain access to a lot of tools, a lot of practices that help them develop more resilience. And we cannot underestimate the impact of developing resilience, because that's going to be one of the biggest challenges in the coming decades. It seems we are on the trajectory of a certain type of collapse, whether that's economic or civilizational or ecological, whatever. We would need to have a certain type of resilience and a certain type of ability to cooperate and collaborate in those difficult moments still, and find meaning in life still. And that's what I see that Buddhism offers in the West. So not necessarily big, wide scale, big social impact at the highest level, like policy making, whatever, but developing our mental resilience and toolkit.
You said that 50 years should be plenty of time to establish Buddhism in Europe. I think that if we look historically, we see actually that when Buddhism or the Dharma moves in from one culture to another, let's say from India into China, it takes probably about 200 or 300 years before you can actually begin to speak of a Chinese Buddhism. In other words, the Dharma has taken on some texturing, coloring, values from its new host culture and becomes, distinctively another iteration historically of the Dharma. And just because we're so clever and have such great communication systems and we can read books from all different traditions, I don't think that is necessarily going to speed things up in modernity. Because I think the transmission of Buddhism at one level is to use your term too, it's very much about embodied values that then find their way over time into the lives of families and communities and Buddhist centers and schools and whatever it might be. So I agree with Gabor. I don't think there's going to be some radical kind of policy change as a result of Buddhism, but I do feel that over time we are pursuing a project that hopefully begins to change the way that people experience themselves in a very fundamental way, their true needs, as it were. But I think if I look back on the 50 years I've been involved in Buddhism, one thing I would notice, there's a huge difference between Buddhism in Europe in 1972, where there was basically hardly any Buddhist centers at all, and a total unawareness of Buddhism in the culture, to today. And I would think primarily, for many people, it's through the mindfulness movement. I don't think one can underestimate how shocking it was for people like myself to suddenly find you could get Buddhist meditation on the National Health Service. We could never have imagined that in the 70s or 80s. And I think, one could say, oh, it's just a mindfulness. I don't think it is. I think mindfulness is actually very much at the heart of the Dharma. And that's not just a personal opinion, it's clear from the texts. And so the fact that that has sort of crept into our culture, I think is very significant.
I pick up on that, and I think that indeed in the embrace of Buddhism, at least over my lifetime, and again, roughly contemporaneous with this, starting, I think my first meditation practice was in 1973. So we've seen that growth of this emphasis on practice. And it may be, though, that we're at an inflection point where we need a reinvestment of connection with the Dharma, the teachings, and getting a bit more sophisticated about that as well. And that's something that I think in Europe, we're poised to do that because of the presence of what was referred to earlier as the diversity of Buddhist traditions in the region across Europe. Maybe I would say it's more like variety at this point, and I'll explain why I have that distinction between variety and diversity. But actually, we've been at this a long time. I mean, Christian Catholic missionaries went to Japan in the 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century, and were interpreting Buddhist texts at that time. I mean, it's hilarious to see how they were interpreting some of the texts. But it's not as if European connections with Buddhism are new. It's a half a millennium already. But the practice of Buddhism in the West is relatively new. And that's been in the last 50 years. And it's changed a lot. The mindfulness movement is huge. What I think is unfortunate is mindfulness can be used for other things than practicing the Dharma. So I was having dinner with some people the other night and mentioned that the United States military for a time was having its elite services, sort of the elite combat units, engage in mindfulness practice so that they could maintain clear focus on the battlefield. This is not Buddhism. This mindfulness cut off from the teachings about compassion and wisdom and all the rest that goes along with Buddhism is not really Buddhism. So one of our tasks is to find vocabularies for explaining Buddhist concepts in contemporary contexts in ways that resonate with young people, especially because that's the future. Explaining stuff to us 70-year-olds, okay, you've got another 5-10 years on the planet. But explaining something to 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, so that they can carry through for another half century, I think that's really the secret. Trying how to address not giving old text and translation necessarily, but taking these Buddhist concepts, the fundamental concepts and principles of Buddhism, and finding ways to express them in terms that make sense to people today. If you look at the explanations of karma that the Buddha gave, he used what was then the key top science of the day, agronomy, plant cultivation. That was the cutting edge science 2,600 years ago in India. Cutting edge science today is something different. We've got evolutionary theory, quantum theory, relativity theory. We should be making use of those resources to explain to young people connections between the worlds they're growing up in and these basic Buddhist concepts in ways that make sense to them, that they can then own and embody. And that's going to be the secret, I think, of going from, yes, we've got mindfulness practice all around the world for stress reduction and you name it, maybe making us free from our capitalist anxieties and being able to be better consumers or to be better leaders of corporations because we can actually manage our people in a mindful way. I think we need to go way beyond that. And the secret to doing that is re-embedding these Buddhist values in those practices.